Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about J.M. Barrie's play, The Admirable Crichton. Now, I really like this play quite a lot. To me, this is somewhere between the wit and satire of Oscar Wilde and the sociology and social satire of Bernard Shaw. So I think it's just fantastic. It's a play that really can be summed up in Crichton's line that circumstances alter cases. So basically, it's a play that's interested in the ways in which, so not that social hierarchy isn't real, because the play very much asserts that it is real, and even that it's natural. But what the play is really interested in is how social hierarchies change in different situations. So we have a 4-act play, 4 different sets of circumstances that alter the cases that these characters find themselves in. So I'll start by telling you about Crichton. Crichton is a very conservative butler to Lord Loam and his family. Lord Loam is a radical egalitarian, sort of. He's officially a believer in equality, and he believes that social hierarchies are unnecessary, and that if returned to the state of nature, human beings would be equal. Which does not stop him from forcing everyone in the household, both his family and servants and any guests they might have, from pretending to all be equals once a month at a servant's tea, which everybody hates, especially Crichton, who's intensely uncomfortable with this, with the idea of the renunciation of hierarchy. But what's really interesting about Crichton's conservatism is that he's not just a sort of straightforward status quo guy. He believes that hierarchies are naturally occurring, but that they're not inevitably set up, that the particular way in which hierarchies occur is not inevitable. So this is really interesting. So Crichton basically believes when we're in England, we have to accept that hierarchies in England work a certain way. They're natural. It's natural that these things occur in this way because this is the way that nature has predisposed them. But in the 2nd act, Crichton, a servant named Tweeny, and the main sort of members of the Loam family are shipwrecked on an island. Their yacht sinks and they're cast away. Crichton proves to be the most adept at surviving on this island. The 3 aristocratic daughters and the cousin are not particularly useful. The priest, the vicar who's sailed with them and is now cast away with them, is more useful, but not particularly helpful. It's mainly Crichton who's building their shelter and gathering food and gathering firewood and all this stuff. And because Crichton, he's still very much a servant in Act 2, but because he's starting to recognize that nature on the island does not necessarily establish the same hierarchy that nature in London society does, he is moving toward becoming more independent. Then in Act 3, we're a couple of years on in the island, and basically Crichton is an almost autocratic ruler of this island. Like, he's in charge of everything. Like, everyone has to do what he says. They're all deferential to him. And this is, in a way, a sort of satire of the aristocratic system that we got in Act 1, where everyone had to obey Lord Loam or the family. All the servants had to obey. So we have a clear reversal of that. But the other really striking thing is that Crichton is the sort of the professor from Gilligan's Island, where like he's built a water mill, or he's built a water wheel that provides electricity for the island. He's built all these tools. He's built hunting implements, fishing implements, etc., etc. He's basically like this sort of genius of island survival who builds all these things out of like, here's a rusty nail and some bamboo, and I'm going to turn it into an electrically run system of bonfires that if a ship is ever sighted, they'll just push a switch and light these bonfires around the island to signal to the ship. Like, it's this crazy stuff. So clearly, like, even though Crichton is this sort of authoritarian figure who requires that everyone is deferential to him, he's much more practically useful than Lord Loam is in the first act. Lord Loam doesn't do much of anything except sort of force the family and servants to hang out together where everybody is uncomfortable, but he's completely oblivious to their discomfort. And then he makes a speech where he like forgets what he wanted to say. So we've got Lord Loam as this sort of aristocratic autocrat who kind of sucks and doesn't do anything useful, contrasted with Crichton, who's this very practical and pragmatic island survivor who provides a good amount of comfort for the people that he's taking care of in exchange for their deference. But then at the end of Act 3, a ship arrives to take them back to London, and in Act 4, they're back in the lives that everybody had lived in the first act. And so we get very interestingly there these sort of issues with people being uncomfortable, having returned. And one of the big things they're uncomfortable with is actually that the family's uncomfortable with is actually Crichton's presence, because he's a reminder to them that their aristocratic position is contingent and somewhat arbitrary. He's also a reminder that they, as aristocrats, had behaved slavishly to a servant, that they had lowered themselves socially and raised above themselves this guy who in London society is very clearly beneath them. But then there are also these other sort of tangible things. Lady Mary, who, to start out for the first two acts, is the most sort of icy and disdainful, proud character. By Act 3, she actually becomes one of the most adept people at living on the island. Like, she's out hunting, she's chasing deer across the island and things like this. And she's actually fallen in love with Crichton, and agrees to marry him on the island. But they get back, and it's interesting because she is the only one of the group who seems unwilling to try and fire Crichton or to, in some way, repress what happened on the island. But she and her father, Lord Loam, actually sort of bond over their discomfort having returned to their traditional places. Because in Act 4, like, she has difficulty entering the room in a feminine way because she had acted very masculine on the island, hunting and all this stuff. So she's doing these sort of double attempts to enter the room and to sit properly like an upper-class lady. She whistles at one point to get her father's attention, and there are all these things that embarrass her because they're a reminder of the time on the island. But Lord Loam also has the same kinds of issues. Like, he tells her that he had... he says, I was dining with half a dozen members of our party last Thursday, Mary, and they were so eloquent that I couldn't help wondering all the time how many of their heads he would have put in the bucket. And I'll actually come back to that a little bit more, but that's a reference to Ernest Woolsey, who is a sort of Oscar Wilde type figure, I think, whom Crichton takes to sticking his head in a bucket of cold water when they're on the island, whenever he comes up with one of his epigrams, which he loves to do. And then Lord Loam is like, my dear, you can't think how irksome collars are to me nowadays. And Lady Mary is unhappy with having to wear skirts and things like this. So we come back to the place that we started, but not in the way that we started it. The circumstances in which they now find themselves post-island have altered the case. They no longer feel comfortable being lazy, pointless aristocrats who do the fancy stuff just for the sake of doing the fancy stuff. So it's an interesting change. But the really interesting thing is that it bears out Crichton's philosophy. Each act of the play bears out this philosophy that Crichton expresses. At one point in Act 1, Catherine, who's one of the daughters of Lord Loam, says, "But father says if we were to return to nature," and Crichton says, "If we did, my lady, the first thing we should do would be to elect a head. Circumstances might alter cases. The same person might not be master. The same persons might not be servants. I can't say as to that, nor should we have the deciding of it. Nature would decide it for us." And then later on in Act 2, when Mary has tried to get Lord Loam to assert that he is in command of the island, Lord Loam says, well, this question is of the leadership. What do you think now, Crichton?" And Crichton says, "My lord, I feel it is a matter with which I have nothing to do." And basically, what he means by that, he goes on a little bit later to say, "It will settle itself naturally, my lord, without any interference from us." And the idea that Crichton has is that whoever is naturally intended to lead will rise to the top and will be put in charge of the society. So it's a really interesting philosophy. And again, this is the George Bernard Shaw type approach. This idea of like modern drama in the very sort of narrow technical sense that we get with people like Ibsen and George Bernard Shaw is largely about exploring big ideas through sort of realistic portrayals of people. And that's what we get in The Admirable Crichton. That's what Barrie is doing here. But we've also got the Oscar Wilde component. That's the other thing that strikes me here that I talked about at the beginning. And again, Ernest Woolsey is the sort of key character with this, because he's actually really hilarious. The first act, especially, of this play is amazingly funny. And a lot of it has to do with like these sort of failures of communication, these sort of disconnects and slips of speech. So Ernest loves epigrams. He loves these sort of short, clever phrases. So like at one point, he says, "I'm not young enough to know everything," which is reasonably clever. And then the stage directions say he looks hopefully from one to another, but though they try to grasp this, his brilliance baffles them. And then they, like, Agatha, Catherine, Lady Mary, these are the three sisters. Like, they're sort of trying to figure it out, but they're also not that concerned if they do or not. And then Traherne, the vicar, comes in, and Ernest repeats this epigram for him. I'm not young enough to know everything. And Traherne says, I see. What you really mean, my boy, is that you're not old enough to know everything. Ernest says, no, I don't. Traherne says, I assure you that's it. So basically they all sort of come together in this not deliberate, but they all come together in this clear failure to recognize the wit of what Ernest has said. And of course, it should not escape us that the wit, the Oscar Wilde type character, is named Ernest, which of course is a subtle reference back to the importance of being earnest, Wilde's most famous play. But this idea of, like, the failure of this humor, like he said something clever, or he said something not even clever, but moderately clever, and no one is clever enough to get it because they can't think in any sort of abstraction. But we've also got some other funny bits here that are more satirical. So, like, in Lord Loam's sort of rambling speech that he makes to this tea party in the first act, where everybody is super uncomfortable, he says, for the time being, the artificial and unnatural, I say unnatural, because he and Crichton had an argument about that, barriers of society are swept away. Would that they could be swept away forever. And then this is possibly one of my favorite stage directions of all time. He says, the page boy cheers and has the one moment of prominence in his life. He grows up, marries, and has children, but is never really heard of again. Just that weird, beautiful moment of, like, the page boy's social consciousness meets Barrie's social consciousness that servants are largely invisible people in Victorian into, I mean, this is 1902, so still Victorian, I think. Because I think Victoria dies in 1901. I can never remember if she dies in 1901 or 1903. But late Victorian, early Edwardian, whatever it is. The sort of invisibility of servants. Combined with Barrie's satiric participation in the erasure of this servant from having any sort of personal prominence of any kind. So it's a fantastic play, really, really interesting. It's right in that sort of vein of what you're getting in from, say, the mid 1880s up through World War I. It's immediately that sort of late Victorian Edwardian style. And again, really, really fascinating stuff.